Hello, everyone. Welcome to the St. Louis Art Museum's Art Speaks program. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I'm the educator for adult learning at the museum. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. We are starting off this school year with today's talk, Class in Session, by Charlie Farrell, the 2022 to 2024 Romer Bearden Graduate Museum Fellow. Thanks so much for being here today, Charlie.
Thank you, Jessica, for that introduction. I will go ahead and get started. And so thank you again for being here with me this afternoon and joining me for lunch. I'm very appreciative of you sharing this moment with me. So as we begin, I'd like to ask you what draws your eye to the work on the left. I notice the young girl's thoughtful gaze. What draws your eye to the work on the right? I notice the woman's unwavering gaze. Do you think that these works have anything in common? While not formalistically similar, they were both created by trailblazing women in their communities, Augusta Savage and Margaret T. Burroughs. Today, I'd like to discuss two women who are leaders in their communities, Augusta Savage and Margaret T. Burroughs. The role of education and support is often overlooked in an artist's legacy. I'd like to complicate the idea of the artist the artist genius as a solo phenomenon, and instead call attention to the fact that education is so important to an artist's development. Artists are both grounded in time and place and are entrenched in broader conversations of their eras. Both Savage and Burroughs were working, at least in part, during the New Negro movement, an artistic movement that began following emancipation began during Jim Crow. Before I proceed, I'd like to talk briefly about the New Negro movement. You may be familiar with this movement as the Harlem Renaissance, but I will refer to it in this talk as the New Negro Renaissance for two reasons. There are movements like these happening in many cities across the United States, not just New York and Harlem. And I'd like to dissociate from the idea that New York is the epicenter of all important artistic movements in the United States. Additionally, this is what thinkers of the time were calling this movement, so I'd like to be respectful and aware of that. The New Negro Renaissance started in about 1918, and I would say ran until the early 1940s. This movement was incredibly important to counter the proliferation of negative images and stereotypes that were coming out during the Jim Crow era. Black people were able to control their cultural narratives to a larger degree. On screen, we see this photograph by James Van Der Zee depicting a Harlem couple in a car and raccoon coats. Van Der Zee's photography documented an emerging African-American middle class. Though this photograph is taken outside, Van Der Zee also owned a studio where he staged shoots, further allowing his patrons to communicate messages of stability, comfort, and individuality. Images like these communicated the progressive ideals of the New Negro movement. And this was a time for Black people to really visually and culturally assert themselves and really communicate their experiences, frustrations, hopes, and dreams through mediums such as books, poetries, plays, music, prints, drawings, sculptures. And this was really a space where Black work could be front and center, and it was incredibly important and affirming. While this movement was far off from Black pride as we know it today, this movement can be considered a precursor to this. This movement existed as a philosophical movement as well as an artistic renaissance, so think visual, musical, and literary arts. And we're going to focus on two artists who came out of different cities, so New York and Chicago, who are working under similar ideological concerns. Right here, we have a quote by Alain Locke, Alain Locke was a writer and philosopher who was a major influencer of the New Negro Renaissance, articulating the philosophical ideas of the movement through his writing. And I will read the quote for you that's on screen. "The Negro is becoming transformed. The Negro has become more of a formula than a human being, a something to be argued about, condemned, or defended, to be kept down or in his place or helped up, to be worried with or worried over, harassed or patronized, a social boogie or a social burden. The Negro today is inevitably moving forward under the control largely of his own objectives. Those of his outer life are happily already well and finally formulated, for they are none other than the ideals of American institutions and democracy." So Locke articulates his ideas in this essay titled "The New Negro" and the anthology "The New Negro and Interpretation." And so we can think of the New Negro persona as a cosmopolitan, educated person moving ahead in social progress, and the old Negro as someone who was more rural. And also, this was also the time of the Great Migration, so you have a lot of African Americans moving from the South to the North for greater economic and social opportunities. And the new Negro, as it was conceptualized during this time, was allowed to grow into themselves and fully embody American ideals of democracy and freedom. And the old Negro was someone who was previously locked out of the nation as they were commodified through enslavement. And this slide right here is a photograph from the United Negro Improvement Association parade in 1920. The United Negro Improvement Association was founded by Marcus Garvey, and it was dedicated to racial pride, economic self-sufficiency, and the formation of an independent Black nation. The sign on screen reads, "The new Negro has no fear," further communicating that African Americans were further asserting their sovereignty and dignity during this movement. That was one aspect of the social and cultural underpinning. Additionally, we have this wider umbrella that artists were working under. So during this period, many artists are working under the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. The WPA was created via New Deal legislation to employ artists during the Great Depression. It was an incredibly broad program with many branches to help keep Americans out of poverty during the Great Depression. The branch that focused on artists was called the Federal Arts Project and employed artists via art centers and workshops. And artists created murals and posters and other public art through these workshops. This administration ran from 1935 to 1943 and at its height employed 3.8 million Americans. Art centers across the country opened with funding from the WPA, and these art centers employed artists to teach lessons, which anyone could take, as well as create posters and other visual media. And each art center in each city varied on what it offered and what it produced. And I bring this to your attention because both Savage and Burroughs worked through WPA centers. So this is just a high-level timeline. There's a lot going on during this time period, and I wanted the takeaway to be that we could see how their work is overlapping in the New Negro Renaissance, and also that their work is part of this continuum, even though the Southside Community Arts Center lives beyond the New Negro Renaissance. So in 1992, we have Augusta Savage born. Margaret Burroughs was born in 1915. The start of the New Negro Renaissance is about 1918. Augusta Savage moves to New York in 1921. Savage founds the Savage Studio of Arts and Crafts in 1931. The Works Progress Administration is formed in 1935. Augusta Savage becomes the first director of the Harlem Community Arts Center in 1937. The Southside Community Arts Center is founded in 1943, and the DuSable Museum was founded in 1961. So who is Augusta Savage? Augusta Savage was born on February 29, 1892 in Green Springs, Florida, a suburb of Jacksonville. She was 7 out of 14 siblings, and she had been sculpting since she was a young child. And she had started sculpting with clay that she had access to. And her father, a Methodist pastor, really felt that this went against their faith and that she was creating graven images, and he beat her to discourage her. It did not work. When Savage was 15, she married John T. Moore, with whom she has her only daughter. Moore passed away shortly after their daughter was born. In 1915, she moves to West Palm Beach with her family, where she marries James Savage. Though Augusta Savage and James Savage divorced in the early 1920s, she kept his last name the rest of her life. After failing at being successful in Jacksonville, she decided to move to New York City to make a living. She attended Cooper Union and graduated in 3 years. Augusta Savage teachers while she was at Cooper Union praised her for being incredibly talented, and she received praise similar to this throughout her career. So Savage is known for her sensitive and expressionistic depictions of her subjects. These naturalistic depictions of her subjects afford humanity and variety to African Americans. The sculpture that is on screen right now is Gammon, and this might be one of her well-known works, modeled after her nephew. Here we can see a young boy with his face upturned looking out. The cap on his head identifies the boy as either a newspaper worker or some other kind of laborer. So Gammon right here functions as a type rather than an individual portrait. And this is further evidenced by the title of the work. Gammon equates to streetwise child in French. The realism that we see in this portrait returns visual humanity back to African American children. This work was incredibly popular and resulted in numerous plaster casts in a life-size bronze. And this work gained her the Rosenwald Fellowship, and she was able to study in Paris. So in 1931, Augusta Savage founded the Savage Studio of Arts and Craft, which offered art classes free of charge, and she invited her students to teach as well. This would have afforded young artists an opportunity not only to learn from Savage, but also mentor each other. In 1937, she became the first director of the Harlem Community Arts Center, which was active from 1937 to 1942. The Community Arts Center was a training point for many other important artists of the New Negro Renaissance. And this was a resource that offered art classes for free or little charge to the community. Again, I want to reiterate that artists don't strive to great heights by themselves. They are in constant conversation with each other, and they are grounded in the time in which they live. I have no doubt that this environment fostered and encouraged creativity among youth. So right here, I've included these photographs to show the diversity in attendees in art classes that were at the Art Center. So on the left, we have young children working on sculptures. On the right, we have teens or young adults drawing. I wanted to reiterate that art was for everyone, and these centers allowed anyone to gain artistic training. Regardless of whether one went on to become a well-renowned artist, there's certainly value in creating space to explore one's creativity and train as an artist. Augusta Savage is a teacher first and foremost, and you can see her beaming with pride surrounded by her students. So this is Augusta Savage in the center. Artists such as Norman Lewis, Gwendolyn Knight, Jacob Lawrence, Morgan and Marvin Smith trained with Savage at one of her two centers. And Lawrence credits Savage with getting him a job through the Federal Arts Program in his early 20s. She literally took him down to the Art Center and enrolled him, and he enrolled in easel painting. And Norman Lewis actually started his career working with Savage in her studio. Augusta Savage persisted past discrimination to carve a space out for African American students to encourage the inner artist. She understood the importance of seeing someone who looked like them creating masterful work. She struggled a lot in her professional life, but that did not stop her in building the spaces that she did for young artists to explore and make work. She intimately understood the difficulties that Black artists face and wanted to create a safe haven from that. And it was Like I mentioned, it was an incredibly difficult time for Savage. Throughout her professional life, she struggled to make sales of her work. An example of the difficulty that Savage faced, in 1923, she received a scholarship to study at the Fontainebleau School of Fine Arts in France. Once the selection committee realized that she was Black, they rescinded her scholarship. The reason that white women could not be expected to share travel accommodations with a Black woman. Her case gained so much attention that it was reported on widely in many newspapers, and W.E.B. Du Bois himself even took up the pen and spoke on her behalf. And this was particularly significant because Du Bois was another important thinker during the New Negro Renaissance. And Savage said about her work, "If I can inspire one of these youngsters to develop the talent I know they possess, then my monument will be their work. No one could ask for more than that." And inspiration went both ways. So right here on the screen, we have a bust of Gwendolyn Knight, who was a student of Savage. And again, we can see her attention to naturalism in her approach. And these are quotes from her students' eyes. So these are two quotes by Jacob Lawrence about Augusta Savage that I will read right now. "People like Augusta Savage were the professional people. She was the professional person in the area at that time, in the Harlem area. And I think countrywide, she was known throughout the Negro communities and probably throughout the American communities when you spoke of the Negro artists. I think Augusta Savage was one of the big names. She was very influential a few years later in making me a professional in that she really liked my work." Here's a quote by Norman Lewis. "It was great. Just meeting her and seeing a Black woman create, or even to see a Black woman try to create out of herself, was a tremendous encouragement for me." So Augusta Savage left the Harlem Community Arts Center in 1938 when she received the 1939 World's Fair Commission for the Harp. This was her largest commission. Unfortunately, she had difficulty finding a buyer after the World's Fair and thus was unable to cast this work in bronze. The plaster was destroyed at the end of the fair, and the sculpture currently only exists as replica minis sold at the fair or in photographs. And again, I mentioned she struggled during this time to make sales of her work, and after what must have been a very frustrating time for her, she moved to Socrates, New York in 1945. While she never again taught at the scale that she did while she was in New York City, she continued to teach locally to the nearby children. This commission was also particularly important, not only because it was exhibited at the World's Fair, but additionally, it is an example of the spirit of the New Negro Renaissance I mentioned earlier. This sculpture, the harp, also titled "Lift Every Voice and Sing," is modeled after the hymn by James Weldon Johnson. At the time, it was known, the NAACP really promoted it as the Negro National Anthem. And this work speaks to the ways in which different artists were inspired by and were in conversation with each other throughout their works. And in this continuum of work that I'm mentioning, Savage was also an example to another art center, the Southside Community Arts Center, which we will transition to speaking about now. The Southside Community Arts Center was founded in part by Margaret T. Burroughs, but who was she? Margaret T. Burroughs was born in 1915 in St. Rose Parish, Louisiana, and in 1920 moved to Chicago with her family. She really identified Chicago as her home. But after she graduated high school, she got her teaching certificate from the Chicago Teachers College, and she received her bachelor's and master's from the Art Institute of Chicago in teaching. So like I mentioned earlier, the WPA funded art centers around the country. The Southside Community Arts Center was opened with funding from the Federal Arts Program in 1940. The Illinois Art Project leadership explained that if the committee could find and buy a building, the Illinois Arts Project would pay for renovations and funds for staff, teachers, and maintenance crews. So Burroughs and the search committee bought the building, which is a mansion at 3831 Michigan Avenue. If you have any Chicago people here, they might recognize that address. And Burroughs and the search committee understood the importance of a space for Black artists to see themselves represented. And Burroughs and Savage were both working in a similar way to fill that vacuum that they saw in their communities. So we had no place to, so Burroughs said of this, we had no place to exhibit. So some of us got together and we decided what we were going to do was try to get a place. We decided what we needed to do was get the money to buy the building. And so I and quite a few others of the young artists, we got collection cans. And Burroughs, in an interview that I was reading in preparation for this, recounts that she was literally on the side of the road collecting coins for the fundraising of the Southside Community Arts Center. Savage visited Chicago during the first instance of her work exhibiting there at the YMCA and the YWCA in 1940, which was a week-long exhibition of her sculptures. The Southside community leadership was really inspired by Savage and invited her to speak at the Southside Community Arts Center. So Augusta Savage gave a lecture titled Crisis, Past and Present, and spoke of her personal and professional struggles as an artist. And she was a bit critical of the African American community's lack of support for Black artists, specifically to those who could afford to do so. She greatly understood the importance of funding and financial support and creating an ecosystem that could support living artists. Great work is not created out of thin air, and artists have to eat to live. And prior to 1940, it was really difficult, if not impossible, for Black artists to exhibit their work. And this is just another photograph from a bit later in 1967 from the Southside Community Arts Center. So artists like Charles White, Elizabeth Catlett, Eliza Coyer, Walter Ellison, and Charles Seabury were involved in the Southside Community Arts Center as teachers, lecturers, or through exhibits. During World War II, programming greatly shifted to accommodate the removal of federal funds. So the WPA project ended in the early 1940s. And again, Margaret Burroughs really saw a need for this art center in her community. And so they really pivoted to fundraise and accommodate the removal of federal funds. And through internal structure changes and lack of funding, they did not close their doors. And to this day, the Southside Community Arts Center is the only art center from the WPA period that is still in operation today. This is quite a feat. So Margaret Burroughs was an artist as well as an educator. She was a talented printmaker, and much of her work centers on the power of Black women and the importance of family and racial harmony. Though her work centers the Black experience, she worked to include universal themes because she wanted her work to be accessible to everyone. In 1952, Margaret Burroughs took a year-long sabbatical from teaching to live in Mexico, where she met Mexico artists and learned this particular style of printmaking. So in Family, on the left, we can see the grooves, and we can see the grooves of the mark making and in the valleys of the couple's face. On the right, there's Black Venus, which is a reference to Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. Here we see a Black woman who is represented as the goddess of love and beauty, and thus a symbol of desire. And here's another work by Burroughs on the beach. This is a linocut in her distinct linear style, and we have a scene of adults and children enjoying a day at the beach. And their leisure and ease is evident in their relaxed posture and the play that the children are engaging in. So Margaret Burroughs was only with the Southside Community Arts Center in a leadership capacity for a few years. That did not stop her desire to educate people. Margaret Burroughs was an educator in the local school system for 27 years. While teaching in the schools, Burroughs noticed that a lot of children did not know their heritage, and this inspired her to found the Ebony Museum of Negro Art and History, and it's now called the DuSable Black History Museum and Education Center. And of this experience, she says, I just couldn't see myself standing in front of a group of eager-eyed young Black people and not being able to tell them something very positive about themselves. So I began to dig out information about our people and share it. And Burroughs really felt that students should know about Phyllis Wheatley and Henry Box Brown, for example, in addition to Paul Revere and Abraham Lincoln. And she worked very hard to build the DuSable Museum from the ground up. So originally it was situated in her mansion, and then her and her husband's mansion, and then they expanded outward to a different building. And to ensure that this building stayed open, she taught herself fundraising. She taught the program capacity may have fluctuated throughout the years, but it was really important to her that Black children in Chicago had this place to learn about themselves. So I wanted to bring us back to the two works that I featured at the beginning of this talk. Right here we have The Face of Africa, which is in the St. Louis Art Museum's collection. Burroughs' work aligned with her activism, and a lot of her work centers the dignity of Black people and centers joy. She firmly believed in creating space and access where she saw lack. In this print, a woman gazes past the viewer with huts and palm trees behind her. In deciding to print a woman instead of a man, Burroughs asserts that women are the face of Africa, the face of the homeland, and a place where African-American artists were drawing inspiration. Her cool demeanor observes action outside the frame. And this work is situated in the legacy of depicting Black people as full human beings deserving of respect and dignity. And I encourage you all to see this work in person. You can easily do so by setting an appointment with the Print Study Room. Their hours are Tuesday through Friday, 10 a.m. to noon, and then 2 to 4:30. Just email print@slam.org to make an appointment. Again, anyone can make an appointment to see prints at the St. Louis Art Museum's Print Study Room. So why does this all matter? Why am I talking about teachers? Why am I talking about art educators and their legacies? I'm a firm believer that we are nothing without our mentors and our teachers and our supporters. I wanted to highlight the legacy and the foundation that's laid for future generations because of our predecessors. Secondly, I have the utmost privilege of giving this talk on the occasion of a recent acquisition entitled Girl with Pigtails. Like I mentioned, Augusta Savage was not very commercially successful despite being praised throughout her life for her naturalistic approach and expertise in crafting expressive sculptures. This acquisition is doubly remarkable because it is one of the few existing works by Savage that was cast in bronze. And this delicate portrait will be on view by the end of October of this year in Gallery 333. So I encourage you all to visit the museum, definitely by the end of October so you can see this work, but also come to the museum because we are free. And right here, if you're interested in just reading more about these two figures, here are some sources that I pulled from. And thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. That was fantastic. So if anyone has questions, I encourage you to put those into the chat. There are actually a few in there, so I'm gonna choose a few. Let's see. Someone has asked, how do you think capitalism affected Burroughs' art/views on art? Asking this because of what you said about her wanting art to be accessible and artists needing to be able to afford to eat.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. How do I think capitalism? I think Margaret Burroughs was really interested in the community-centered approach, and so creating strong communities that could support artists outside of a larger federal structure. Because like I mentioned, after the WPA program ended, the federal funds were removed, and a lot of these art centers, like all of them, were shut down. Okay, so we live in a capitalistic society, and it influences a lot of our decisions one way or another. So I don't know how much of she was thinking about her activism in relation to capitalism, but I think she was really thinking of her work in a community-centered way. I will say, with the removal of federal funds in 1943, part of the programming changes that the Art Center, the Southside Community Art Center, instituted was to include more established artists that were seen as less radical, because they now had to appease there's a greater need to appease the constituents in their local community.
Yeah, well, that's probably something, not probably, that's something that still happens, so understandable. Okay, so let's see, we have a lovely comment. Charlie, that was wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Let's see. This is another deep question. So, can you explain what you mean by Savage granting Black people visual humanity through her art?
Yes. So during the 1920s and 1930s, there were just a lot of racist caricatures, I will say, being created in wider visual culture. And I think in Savage choosing to depict Black people, what they looked like in such a delicate way, she's asserting that, we're not caricatures, we don't look like gollywag dolls, like we're human beings. And having a Black woman give that to Black people as opposed to maybe a white artist really creates this community, but this creates this centering of Black artistic values for Black consumption versus a different audience. I hope that answered your question. Feel free to ask a follow-up question if I did not answer.
Yeah, please type it in. But I think that sounds like it answered to me. Also wanted to ask a little bit about their families. We had a couple of questions about their families. Were their families, supportive? I know you mentioned I think it was Burroughs' husband, or they were in their house for a long time, set up in their house. So what was the family, I guess, dynamic for both of these artists?
So I guess the Savage's family in the beginning wasn't really supportive of her art making practice because of her, like I mentioned, her father was a Methodist pastor, and he felt that she was creating graven images. But there's a hurricane in Florida in the 1920s, and her family did end up living with her. And so I'm assuming that they kind of got over it if they stayed with her for a period of time. And Burroughs' family was always really supportive of her artist career and her being a teacher. She worked closely with her husband, Charles Burroughs, to found the DuSable Art Center. So I would say that he was fairly supportive. They worked really closely together.
Great, thank you. Okay, and I think this will be our last question. And it's an interesting one. So how can museums share the legacies of artists like Savage and Burroughs outside of settings like these? So I'm guessing, this talk like we're doing. From staff members to our museum guests, how can we engage in these stories across disciplines in our museums? And maybe not just through an art museum.
Okay. I would say education, including artists like these in teachings of art historical canons, or creating curriculum that centers Black historical visual legacies, and then that being the whole class. I mean, there's a lot of really, I think, important African American work in our collection that you may not know is by an African American artist. So I'm thinking particularly of Edmonia Lewis's Portrait of a Woman. You wouldn't learn that. You wouldn't know that Edmonia Lewis was an Afro-Native artist just by looking at the work, because that's not referenced in that work. But I would say like going through SLAM's website, slam.org, going through collection and just like looking and doing that research for yourself. Because there's a lot of work that, Black artists are creating that doesn't always reference identity. We have a Robert Dickinson, and that's a landscape. So just doing some of that digging, I would say. And I will say that work has been done, and so it might just be a matter of doing some uncovering in going through our archives and what we've already done in relation to that.
Yeah, and we do have, fully agree. I know that we have several recorded talks actually on those artists. So feel free to go on our website. Lots of these, just like this one today, is being recorded to be put up on our website and the YouTube channel. We've got lots of other ones as well. All right, well, thank you. And thank you, Charlie. We've got lots of nice comments in here just saying thank you and well done. And I want to thank everyone who came today. Really appreciate you attending these. Please join us next week on Thursday, September 14th at 12:30. It's a little bit later than usual, at 12:30, to hear curators Hannah Clem and Andrea Purnell speak about the artwork and themes in the exhibition, The Culture, Contemporary Art and Hip Hop in the 21st Century, which just opened a couple of weeks ago. So I really look forward to that. And thanks again, Charlie, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.